We are speaking with Dr. Christian Costamagna. He has written some interesting historical and geopolitical analysis on what is known as the Special War, a war Yugoslavia fought against numerous internal and external enemies, including the Soviets, the United States, internal fifth columns, irredentist ethnic groups, and nationalist diasporas seeking an independent republic. The war in Yugoslavia is a very difficult subject to attempt to explain. I am a Croatian who, in parts, grew up in both Yugoslavia and the independent Republic of Croatia, as well as the United States, and I am still not sure 100% of what happened. There is just too much ultranationalism on all sides, foreign interference, media propaganda, revisionist history, and muddy waters to wade through. My understanding is that the United States and its vassals in the EU wanted to break apart and balkanize Yugoslavia. At the same time, Tito was the glue that held Yugoslavia together. His demise was the beginning of the end. The Bretton Woods system, like the IMF, attempted to conquer Yugoslavia through debt. And of course, economic failure in the 80s was an important factor in Yugoslavia's demise. On top of that, the ethnic tensions that have brewed for centuries were ready to ignite once again. Before we look at what you call the Special War, Dr. Costamagna, could you tell us how you came to be interested in the subject and what is your understanding of what happened in Yugoslavia?
I started to be interested about in Yugoslavia a long time ago when I was a teenager. I was very touched by the everyday flux of news coming from a newspaper and TV about the war in Croatia and then in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So it was for me the beginning of my interest. At the time it was, let's say, a kind of a hobby. So I started to read some books such as also novels such as Ivo Andrić, and also some books about history, the history of Yugoslavia in Italian language, of course. Year after year, I cultivated this. And so during my PhD in history, where I worked in the archives of Belgrade and Ljubljana in Slovenia. So the topic of my dissertation was rise to power of Slobodan Milošević in the second half of the 1980s, and the general political context in Yugoslavia, in Serbia and Kosovo. And finally, jumping to the article we are today discussing, I had some documents with the transcripts of the League of Communists of Yugoslavia. They were accessible in 2012 just in Slovenia because they are Serbia and Slovenia have different laws about the archives. So in Serbia, where in the archives of Yugoslavia based in Belgrade, they have all of the complete collection of those documents, but unfortunately for historians, you have to wait 30 years before accessing them. And so I could access a part of those documents of the presidency of the League of Communists of Yugoslavia in Slovenia, in Ljubljana. So later, between last year and 2016 and 2017, I had the time and the opportunity to think about the significance of those of the content of those documents. So I thought that it could be a good idea to share with the scientific community, but also the public, the documents produced by the Yugoslav military leadership. They were speaking and discussing about the special war against their country, of course, Yugoslavia, and especially what the big foreign powers were trying to do in order to destabilize Yugoslavia in the context of the internal crisis of the country, and especially in the second half of the 80s, the economic crisis, social crisis, but also political crisis, led to different issues that the political leadership of the time was in trouble how to handle them. For example, the Kosovo issue was probably among the most difficult to solve, but also how to reduce the unemployment, how to stop the high inflation, and let's say the rage of the common Yugoslav citizen against the political leadership gave the opportunity to some politicians to exploit that sentiment with demagogy, in a populistic way, let's say, and nationalistic. That's, of course, my understanding, my interpretation of those historical events. But still, I thought that an analysis of the, as seen from the point of view of the Yugoslav military elite and leadership could help us to have a better understanding and a different angle about the Yugoslav crisis, dissolution, and then war. So that's why I thought that it was time to exploit and use those documents I had in order to develop and try to have a new insight about those events. Especially in the last decades, we have and we had a lot of new scholarship in the sense of new books, research, articles, papers, and so on about different Yugoslav-related topics. But the more, let's say, political related one was put, let's say, in the background. Not always, not in every single case, of course, but still this is a more general trend. I don't think about my article as, of course, the last word about the Yugoslav crisis or the special war against Yugoslavia, if we want to use that concept. Simply, I think that it can be a stimulus for the debate among historians and, if possibly, among the public opinion, and the starting point for something new, for new research based on the new documents that essentially based in Belgrade in the archives of Yugoslavia, that in the following years they can the future historians they may produce a more articulated history and understanding of the crisis, and especially the role of the foreign powers. I'm not saying this because I think that the main reason rests and is based outside Yugoslavia, the reason of the crisis or the war. I am saying this because unfortunately there are a lot of reconstructions of the dissolution of Yugoslavia that are based of some sort or some kind of conspiracy theories that they have no historiographical value and they had no real understanding and knowledge. So I thought that maybe trying to understand with the help of new historical sources, we can maybe try to have a new comprehension and abandon all those and put in the background all those conspiracy theories about the role of the United States or other foreign powers.
Let's look at, examine that a bit. I don't know if you would agree with my intro, and I agree with what you said, that to say that it was entirely a foreign initiative would be too much, that you had the real economic failure toward the end of the 80s of Yugoslavia. You had the ethnic tensions, you had the internal politics. But I think let's talk about some of these specific examples of the special war. And that, yes, there were, I think, external forces that, they would give a push in this or that direction that would perhaps help the situation fall apart. And let's talk about the U.S. Well, you mentioned the French. I think were the only ones in favor of keeping Yugoslavia whole. But you quote the Yugoslav Minister of Defense as saying, more and more, quote, more and more, the U.S. are considering the possible destabilization of Yugoslavia, and that the long-term goal of the USA was to change the socio-political system in the country and make Yugoslavia join the Western positions. And in the context of the Cold War, this makes sense. And just a fun fact, just 3 days ago, you also mentioned Albania. 3 days ago, there were some files that were declassified by Judicial Watch that show how the Obama administration used $9 million to interfere in Albania's political system and elections recently. So we do have, factual, documented evidence of such things. But could you tell us first a little bit about what was U.S.'s role in this special war? What were the Yugoslavs fearing?
The role of the United States was, especially in the 80s, a bit ambiguous. From a certain point of view, they were continuing to support the Yugoslav regime and Yugoslavia as a unified state, because it was in function against the Soviet Union and the present in the possible interference of Soviet Union in the southern east part of Europe. But we had also a not official side of this American policy that was to, in the long term, to try to challenge and change the Yugoslav regime, because it was a socialist regime led by communists, and of course it was not, let's say, acceptable for the United States, since they were promoting democracy, free elections, market, and so it was not good from their point of view. So we have to keep in mind these two parallel policies to help Yugoslavia, but on the other hand, also to support some internal dissension against the regime. For example, we know in the late 80s, all the NGOs like Amnesty International and others, so we are not talking this moment about the US as government, we are talking about NGOs, but still they were supporting main Yugoslav dissidents. And this was, of course, also favored by the West in general. So, for example, Franjo Tuđman or Vojislav Šešelj and others, they had the opportunity to travel abroad, out of Yugoslavia, and to speak to the audience, to the public in Western countries, from France or US. It is true that they were mainly talking with the émigrés, with the Yugoslavs abroad, living and working abroad, the communities of Croats or Serbs or other nations in Western countries, from Canada to Australia. So that's true that their main target as audience were them. But still, they had also a relation with some politicians or NGOs, Western NGOs abroad, out of Yugoslavia. So that is an example. Another example was the help that the International Monetary Fund gave until almost the end of the existence of Yugoslavia, money, financial help. And that was, let's say, for Yugoslavia, on the one hand, it was good to have that financial help, but on the other side, it was not used and invested in a appropriate way most often, because they created very giant enterprises, state. Okay, it was not state, it was self-managed enterprises, but still it was a public property. And they created employment, they created consensus in that in the population of those areas, but still, since they were not very profitable investment, it had a boomerang effect on the general economy of Yugoslavia, and as a state, it became more and more dependent on foreign help, let's say from US to Western other Western countries. So it was a way for the West to influence also the policies and the political economy and the political choices of the Yugoslav leadership. So it was, let's say, a sort of way to put pressure and influence the internal choices. Another way of influence, as I describe in the article, it was, for example, from the point of view of the Yugoslavs, at least, or of the military leadership and part of the political leadership, the exchange of students, Yugoslav students that went for some months, let's say, in some American university, that was a way to influence and brainwashing the Yugoslav students in order to put in their heads some ideas about consumerism and political freedom, etc. So we had different levels of putting pressures and try to change slowly in the long term the consensus of the internal regime. So let's say it is in the context of the Cold War, it is understandable in the sense that, of course, each of the two blocs try to englobe and to new countries in their sphere of influence, and to maybe with some coup d'etat to pressure and change the regime in a country. Well, but in the case of Yugoslavia, at least, and especially in that decades in the 80s, of course, we didn't have that, the explicit pressure for, let's say, a coup d'etat or something like that. It was just a slow promotion of the values of the West, freedom, multi-party, and market-oriented economy. And the internal crisis of economic, social, political crisis of Yugoslavia gave the factual opportunity to Washington and other Western states to influence and to exploit that specific situation. So what I think it is important in some historiographical reconstruction of the dissolution of Yugoslavia, there is this understanding of saying, okay, the United States, I mean, just doing an example, the United States, or let's say the West, wanted explicitly since the beginning or something like that to destroy Yugoslavia as a country. If we take this interpretation as it is, it doesn't help us too much to understand the historical events. We should try to divide different topics, different historical elapse of time, and be much more accurate. For example, it is acceptable to say that the West tried and actually did influence and wanted to change in the long term the internal political system of Yugoslavia. They didn't, let's say, like the self-managed socialist system. So that it was true. It was true. It is possible to say that the West tried indirectly to weaken that regime.
Yes, and let's just talk briefly about the other superpower, the Soviet Union. You mentioned, I believe, the Yugoslav leaders among themselves perhaps mentioned one possibility of many that there could have been a division of Yugoslavia between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. It seems the Soviets were competing with Yugoslavia in the sphere of arms sales to the Third World. Gorbachev made a visit, I think, in '88, if I'm not mistaken, to Yugoslavia to speak with the leaders there. So could you just briefly, you've mentioned the U.S.'s agenda, and so what was the Soviets? What were they looking for?
Yes, the Soviets, they, of course, already at the time with Gorbachev as a secretary of the party, they already had their own internal problems. Still, there was, of course, the let's say the long-term goal of the Soviet Union was to head back Yugoslavia in their sphere of influence, like before, let's say, 1948. But that was, let's say, a long-term goal to go through, as the Yugoslavs said in those documents, access to the hot water in the Adriatic Sea, in the Mediterranean Sea. That one thing. But what I was able to read in those documents, especially I'm talking now about the Gorbachev visits in Yugoslavia in 1988, it was how the Yugoslavs were in, yes, as you said, as you mentioned, in competition with the Soviets and other countries in selling weapons to the third world countries, especially in Africa, for example, in Algeria or in Ethiopia. So that competition in selling weapons was created some, let's say, troubles between the two countries, Soviet Union and Yugoslavia. That was quite interesting, and usually, let's say, it is very hard to find any mention in the academic literature about this topic. And another, but especially let aside this topic, Gorbachev explained how he was, let's say, preoccupied and worried about the West was challenging the socialist countries. And let's say that from this point of view, while Gorbachev didn't maybe use the term special war, but still it is quite clear that there was a competition, and he was very quite scared. For example, he thought that the financial help to Poland was a way to put from the side of the West was another possible way to influence and to put under influence that country, Poland, of the West, or the West was exploiting nationalism in the Soviet Union. In the technological sphere, Gorbachev was thought and said in that specific occasion, at least, that the United States and let's say the West achieved higher levels of scientific development, especially in the field of computers. So, and that was considered in Soviet Union a problem. So Gorbachev tried to open new research centers. So let's say that technology and the sector of finance were the two most critical points in the socialist countries in the Soviet sphere of influence and in the same Soviet Union. And I must add that if we think about Yugoslavia at the time, but let's say by the end of the 80s, it is hard to say that they were really scared about Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union was, let's say, a real danger, was considered by the Yugoslavs and Tito himself a danger, let's say, until the maybe first half of the 80s. Later, with all the change in Eastern Europe, it was not really such a big challenge. The real challenge to the internal political condition in Yugoslavia came especially, or were perceived to came from the West. There is something that I didn't write in the article because I thought about it later. It is possible that some of the statement of the Admiral Branko Mamula or General Veljko Kadijević at the time were also intended to use the concept, to adopt the concept of a special war at the time, and a certain declaration in the context of the Slovenian Spring in 1988 was also a way to put pressure on the Slovenian to say, okay, be careful, because if we open too much our individual freedoms, the risk is that other foreign countries will exploit us, will destroy Yugoslavia. In the sense that they used, Mamula or Kadijević, used the ghost, let's say, of the foreign enemy in order to obtain results, internal results in Yugoslavia. I mean, that's something that I was thinking about after I published the article. So, of course, this must be checked. And in the archives, it is something just an hypothesis at this level.
And that's a classic strategy for people in power to discuss internal or external enemies, which will give them more power to the state for whichever reason. So, in your conclusion, in a way you don't conclude, you say that this kind of paves the way for future research in terms of the special war. Were you one of the first to develop this concept or unearth this concept, or perhaps in the English-speaking world? Can you just tell us a bit about the literature review and where this might advance? Is it advancing?
The special war, I mean, it is a theory, a doctrine inside the self-managed system in Yugoslavia. So there are also some books, Yugoslav books published in the 70s and the 80s about the topic. For example, there is one, it is Specijalni rat Yugoslavia by Vojislav Mićović, and another one, it means, of course, a special war in Yugoslavia. And the second one is Specijalni rat odbrana I zaštita, it is a special war, defense and protection by Dušan Vilić and Milan Ateljević. I mean, so let's say in the English publication, English literature, there is maybe from time to time some mentions. For example, in the first half of the 90s, I think in 1994, Victor Meyer, he published a book originally in German language, and then Sabrina Ramet translated it into English. And in his book, he about the Yugoslav political crisis and then war, talked, let's say, touched that topic, but and not only him, but in general terms, let's say, in the English literature, it is at the special war topic. It is not at all developed. It is not considered seriously. Why this? Probably, I suppose that it was not probably one of the most important reason of the Yugoslav dissolution and war. Maybe because the special war topic, it looks like too much close to the conspiracy theories. So it is not, let's say, somehow credible or believable, let's say. I don't know the real reason, but still it is a matter of fact that it is not well developed. In the, let's say, in the literature, in Serbian or Croatian languages, the situation, of course, is different, especially in Serbia. Let's say there are some books that touch the topic, but they maybe use the prism, the theory of a special war applied to what happened later in the 90s to Yugoslavia. So in my article, I use the special, I analyze the special war against Yugoslavia to a very limited elapse of time. I mean, just the end of the 80s. So I don't go beyond that. So let's say, in general terms, it is not a very developed. It is not analyzed in the literature.
Finally, is there anything that I have missed important, or do you have a final thought? What's our takeaway from this idea of the special war in Yugoslavia?
I think that in the future, if the data will be sustained by the archives in Belgrade, but let me add also probably in Washington or in Moscow. I have no idea, honestly, about what in the future the historians may find there. But still, use of this concept may add some understanding of what the Yugoslav perceived, the Yugoslav leadership at the time perceived about the foreign threats, but also a more precise, a more correct understanding of the influence of the foreign influence in the development of the subsequent events that led to the dissolution, how the West approached the Yugoslav crisis, maybe with some misunderstanding on each side. And even if we don't like the special war doctrine or theory, I would say that that doesn't matter so much. It is important the content of those documents in the archives that can give us some very important details or information. For example, I mentioned in the article a report made by Admiral Branko Mamula at the end of 1987, and in a footnote of a document I adopted for the article, he was Mamula. He was talking about, for example, that in case of a really deep crisis in Yugoslavia, because of Kosovo and the issues between Albanians in Kosovo and Serbs, in that case, maybe the United States could stop to support the integrity of Yugoslavia as a state, and instead of that, support a greater Albania in order to obtain the, let's say, more stability in the Balkans. Of course, at the time, in the context of the Cold War, it was important to have an ally, a regional ally, enough let's say, strong, and that could stabilize the region in order to challenge the influence of the Soviet Union, for example. So to that information, of course, must be verified in the archives in the United States, etc. It is not enough to challenge all the historiography about the Kosovo issue in Yugoslavia. Still, it is important to have some deep insight in those historical events. So that's why I think, honestly, that it is important to continue in the future to unearth in the archives some documents and try to at least exploit the field, let's say, of the special war.
Well, hopefully somebody out there listening will continue this research, or perhaps we'll hear more about it from you in the future. Grazie, Dr. Costamagna, for your very, very interesting research. It was a great pleasure speaking with you. We'll put the links in the descriptions and hope people go out and read this fascinating material. And thank you once again.
Thank you very much to you, Kvoje, for this interview. I mean, unfortunately, my English and my ability to speak English is not that well developed. Still, I hope that I could explain some of the main points of the article.